I don't know about you, but I don't know much about vaccines. So I thought I would convene a panel of three people who do, who can maybe talk about the possibilities of what these vaccines will achieve, maybe the limitations of them as well, how vaccines are actually developed, and why we should be able to trust the science that develops them, because there does seem to be an awful lot of scepticism around at the moment. I've said before on this programme, I'm not interested in hearing from conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers, just not interested at all. But I do think that it is legitimate to ask the question, well, how can we trust something that has been developed in such a short time? I think that is a legitimate question for anybody to ask. So this is your chance, 0345 6060 973. Well, I'm joined by Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner, who's a researcher in international law and global health, pandemic preparedness and access to vaccines at Keele University. Professor Susan Michie is a Professor of Health Psychology and Director of the Centre for Behavioural Change at UCL, who's also a member of SAGE, and Professor Gordon Dougan, who is Professor of Microbial Pathogenesis at the University of Cambridge, who's an expert on vaccines and who's served on several World Health Organization committees. Well, welcome to all three of you. Let's start by talking about the hope that everyone has had that a vaccine would be developed. The politicians have been very keen to not try to be too over-optimistic, but the news from the last few days, I think, gives us all a degree of optimism. Mark Eccleston-Turner, let's start with you. Do you feel as optimistic as everybody else about what's been announced?
I think that there's very good reason to be optimistic. I think that what we're seeing here is some very positive interim analysis in the final stages of vaccine development. So vaccines are developed across a number of stages, and we're currently at stage 3, which is the large in-human studies with a high number of participants. And the data which is coming out there shows that the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine today do look like they have some good efficacy and a good safety profile associated with them. We obviously have to wait for the full data to come out and for it to be peer reviewed and submitted to the regulators, but this is encouraging news. The one thing I would temper here in terms of our optimism is vaccines don't work they don't exist in laboratories, and they don't work when they're in laboratories. They work when they're in people, and they work when they're in people en masse. And that the next stage which is going to come, which is going to be the manufacturing at scale, the rollout and delivery through a very complicated cold chain to move this vaccine, first of all, around the UK, but also around the world, and the level of infrastructure and resources which you need to get this vaccine actually into people, and overcoming, as you referred to in your introduction, a degree of vaccine hesitancy or skepticism in the world, is a real challenge. And we're looking good, but we're not out of the woods yet. We're about to face some quite big challenges, but a different sort of challenge. We seem to have overcome the R&D hurdle. Now we move on to infrastructure and societal-based problems, which in many ways are more complex than R&D and the actual development of products.
Well, which is a good link to go to Susan Michie. Susan, you're a director of the Centre for Behavioural Change here, and I think that is so relevant to our discussion this evening, where those of us who really don't understand vaccines, we understand why we have to have them. Some of us intrinsically trust them, but there seem to be a lot of people that are doubtful as to whether they will take the vaccine when it's available. What do you put that down to?
Yes, there are many people who one can describe as being hesitant, but this means they're asking questions. People want to know, is it effective? Is it effective for me? How long is it likely to be effective for? And also, people want to know, are there any side effects and what the safety is? And these are very valid questions. And I'd say that probably the majority of people want answers to those questions before they would definitely have the vaccination. And that's very, very different from the very small number of people who have a fixed attitude against vaccination of any kind. So I think it's important that we recognise people's concerns and understand their concerns, and ensure that the communication that is given about the vaccines actually addresses those. And it's not only about how effective, are there any side effects, any safety issues, but it's also people want to be reassured about the process as to how the vaccine's been developed. We know that it's been put through at a speed that's very unusual, because obviously there's a huge imperative to get vulnerable people protected and hopefully make good progress in terms of building up immunity. But obviously when you put things through at speed, people want to know that all the procedures, all the safety checks have really been done properly.
Professor Gordon Dougan, when you look at some of the logistical challenges that Mark was referring to here, and particularly, I'm not just referring to logistical challenges in this country, but if these vaccines are to work properly, they need to be available throughout the world. Not just in so-called developed countries like ours. They need to be available to people in poorer countries who might not have the money to afford the same kind of treatments as we can offer here. How confident are you that there will be a worldwide system put in place that will mean that the whole world can benefit from these, not just people in the so-called first world?
Well, I think first of all, there's a collective sense of relief that we've got to the stage where we have a vaccine that is still in the game, or several vaccines that are still in the game, where we've got some very interesting and significant efficacy and protection data. So as the previous speakers have said, the next challenge, and you allude to, is trying to get that vaccine out there. And there are a number of organisations that have been preparing really to get vaccines not only out within the UK, but across into low, middle-income countries. There's organisations created called CEPI, which is really designed was prepare for epidemics. There's Gavi, which was started about 30 years ago to try to get vaccine uptake in the sense of affordable vaccines, where countries could afford vaccines at a lower price. But the logistical complications are things like the cold chain, where you've got to get vaccines not only to a particular setting of a country, but then you've got to get out to the poor. And that is a real logistical challenge. But the good news is we've got several different types of vaccines, and some of those vaccines are more suited to those challenges than other ones.
But for example, if somebody develops a vaccine that maybe is 50% effective as opposed to the 90% that Pfizer is saying, or 94.7% that Moderna is saying, so it's 50% and it's half the price of the other vaccines. Is it really? Are we really going to say that? Well, in the middle of India, for example, which I mean, India has been very badly hit by coronavirus, and in poor areas in the middle of India, they're going to have to settle for a second best vaccine.
Well, there are vaccines that are available in India and actually manufactured in India, because India has actually, ironically, got a very good manufacturing system. For example, the rotavirus vaccine has in India an efficacy around 50%. But you also get on top of that herd immunity protection. And that vaccine is rolled out. It's rolled out and manufactured within India. The bigger challenge probably is on the African continent, where there's no vaccine manufacturer and there's very little infrastructure. That's why these organizations are trying to prepare, if you like, load up finances to roll the vaccines out into those settings, and they're trying to create an infrastructure really as we speak. Ebola helped a little bit, because in the sense that Ebola, we've got some planning in place, even for the really frozen vaccines like we've heard about. But there's a big ask now to try to get those vaccines out to those sorts of settings.
Mark Eccleston-Turner, is there a percentage of the population that you need to get to make a vaccine really effective? I mean, is it sort of 80%, 90%, or is it just one of those things where, okay, if only 30% take it, it will obviously still be effective for those 30%?
So the more people that take the vaccine, the better. You have what is called the herd immunity threshold, which is the number of people, or the percentage of the population which you require to take the vaccine to eliminate its reproduction, to stop it from spreading around the population. And that varies from virus to virus, and it's typically upwards of 70%. With some viruses, you need a herd immunity threshold of around 90%. But on your point earlier about moving this virus around the world, which I think is a really important, moving this vaccine around the world, which is a really key point. One of the important aspects to consider here is that the previous speaker mentioned India. So the Pfizer vaccine must be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius. Right up until the sort of day before it is actually administered to a person. These are called sort of super freezers, and the infrastructure to actually allow you to keep a vaccine safe and at minus 70 just really does not exist outside of a very small handful of high-income countries. The Moderna vaccine, which published some data today, has a bit of a better chance there because that can be kept at refrigeration temperatures for around 30 days and still be safe and effective. So the Moderna vaccine represents a very good chance for some developing countries and low-income countries to actually receive benefits. I don't think the Pfizer vaccine will be successfully rolled out into many low-income countries as it stands. But what we are seeing is that the supply for the Moderna vaccine and for the Pfizer vaccine is being dominated and has been almost exclusively eaten up by high-income countries who are trying to secure enough vaccine for their own populations first. So there are two issues around moving this vaccine and getting this vaccine into low-income countries where it is needed. Number one is the infrastructural problems of a lack of cold chain in these countries and an inability to move the vaccine safely to these countries. But the second one is the fact that high-income countries are dominating the global supply at the moment. These vaccines can be made in very low numbers at the moment. We're talking about, Pfizer say 50 million doses by Christmas. All of that supply has been already taken up by a small number of high-income countries. So there are two issues here around global access. One of them is infrastructure, but the other one is supply, and supply being dominated by a small number of countries.
We're going to come to your calls in a moment, 0345 6060 973. If you've got any questions on the vaccine, the development of the vaccine, the rollout, the logistics, the civil liberties aspect as well of this, 0345 6060 973. Susan Michie, just on that aspect, I think a lot of people are concerned about the civil liberties side here. And some people are even saying the government should make it mandatory for anyone for people to have the vaccine. And if you haven't had a vaccine, you shouldn't be allowed into the country afterwards. I mean, there are a lot of issues here, aren't there?
There are a lot of issues. I'd say the very first issue is that we have no idea at present whether the vaccines make people less infectious. All we know is that we think there's a good chance that they reduce the symptoms and reduce the disease. But if people are without symptoms but carry on being just as infectious, then we've got a very different ballgame. We've got a problem. And we know that there are many, many people who are infectious without having any symptoms. So we absolutely can't assume that the vaccine can do more than protect vulnerable people. So the strategy in the UK is for the vaccines we have to be rolled out to protect vulnerable people, whether they're residents and workers in care homes and hospitals or the elderly. Those are the first groups to have it. Now, the whole issue about doing this for other people, doing this to build up population immunity, is dependent on the vaccinations reducing infectivity and conferring immunity long term. And as yet, we don't know about that. But we certainly know that any kind of enforcement would be counterproductive. Definitely not the way to go.
Gordon Dougan, do you agree with that?
I agree with it. I mean, it's fortunate that most vaccines, or many vaccines, do protect against transmission as well as protect against a disease. But we don't want to get to a situation where we develop what we call carriers, for example, silent carriers. And we will have to evaluate that very carefully. But when you've got a vaccine at 90% efficacy, which we've got, and that may reduce over time as they get more data in slightly, that's better than, as you say, starting with a vaccine with 50%, because what carries normally is it's where you've got lack of immunity at the periphery, at the surfaces of the body. And we want to make sure that these vaccines do deliver that kind of immunity and that people are not colonized. You can check that after vaccination and challenge, and you want to make sure that they don't transmit on.
Well, lots of points to come out of this. We're going to come to your calls in a moment with our three guests. I'll reintroduce them after we go to a short break. It's 19 minutes past 9.
This is Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
23 minutes past 9. Right, let me reintroduce my panel to you. Very learned panel we've got tonight. Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner, who's a researcher in international law and global health, pandemic preparedness and access to vaccines. He's at Keele University. Professor Susan Michie is Professor of Health Psychology and Director of the Centre for Behaviour Change at UCL and also a member of SAGE, and Professor Gordon Dougan is Professor of Microbial Pathogenesis at the University of Cambridge. He's an expert on vaccines and has served on several World Health Organization committees. We're talking about the vaccines. I'm sure you've all got lots of questions, and hopefully they can answer as many of them as possible over the next 35 minutes or so. Let's go to Michael in Eastbourne. Hello, Michael.
Oh, good evening, Ian.
Hi.
My question to the panel is, I wonder if they could explain in lay terms how the two vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, made such a huge step in viral research. They're RNA viruses or vaccines, I should say, and I just wondered if it could be explained why some people think that this will shorten the time for finding cures for other diseases.
Gordon, I think that may be one for you.
Yeah, so they are a new form of vaccine, and what they do is they take advantage of the way that proteins are made in the body from what you call DNA via an intermediate called RNA. So the beauty of this is that you can actually take the RNA, immunize, and then the body will take the RNA and use that to make the protein which protects. The nice thing about this system is that it can be adapted to make lots of different variants of proteins, but also lots of proteins from other organisms or the viruses or the pathogens or the germs. And so there's flexibility there to try to develop new types of vaccines. So in that sense, it is a platform that can be used to target lots of different diseases. So it's a platform, not only is it a vaccine in its own right.
Will it hold mutations?
Well, what it can do, you can actually introduce mutations into a test platform and check out different variants of the protein that you're trying to immunize with. It looks like these platforms are very stable in the sense that once you've introduced that mutation will be stable.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much for that. Well, just on that, Gordon, I mean, a lot of people are texting and tweeting and saying, well, how can we trust this? If we can't find a vaccine for the common cold, how can we trust a vaccine on this? Well,
I think the important thing is this is a new platform and it's delivered very quickly, and it's the first time it's really been validated in terms of efficacy in humans. So we need to be very careful with this particular vaccine in terms of collecting as much safety data as we possibly can. It's already been into 22,000 people with the Pfizer vaccine. It's already been reproduced in a slightly different variation in the Moderna vaccine. In another, I think it's around 15 out of 30,000 people who get the vaccine. And as we then start to immunize more people, we'll build up a safety portfolio on the technology and on the vaccine. And that will continue even after licensing the vaccine.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Philip in Whiteleaf has texted this, and several other people have raised this too. Perhaps you could ask your experts, if vaccines are so safe, why does the government have a vaccine damage compensation scheme? Mark Eccleston-Turner, I think that's probably one for you.
So the reason vaccine damage compensation schemes exist, and they exist in a number of countries, is because, so the way in which product liability generally works is you have to, imagine you've been harmed by a product you purchased. It doesn't have to be a vaccine. You buy some new lipstick and it causes blistering on your lips or something like that. What you have to do is demonstrate causation, is prove causation. You have to prove that the product caused, in fact and in law, caused the harm which you received. You can't just have temporal proximity. It can't be just the timings were similar. I put on some lipstick and a couple of hours later I developed these blisters. That's not good enough as a point of law. Now, the reason vaccine product liability schemes exist is that proving causation costs so much in terms of if you get harmed by a vaccine, for example, Iain, the amount you will spend on lawyers and on scientists to go through the court to argue about causation and the scientific burden of proof and the evidence merely costs too much, and it clogs up the court system, and it's a better usage of our time to just say, if you have a certain set of harms which could arise from a vaccine, which are very, very minimal harms, it must be said, in almost all circumstances, it's much easier that the manufacturer will say, we do not admit guilt here, we do not admit liability, but we are willing to offer compensation regardless, just to speed up the process. It's one of efficiency.
But is it true that the government have effectively said to manufacturers who are fast-tracking these vaccines that they will be protected from civil liability if the vaccine is later found to cause harm?
So I don't know if that's true with the vaccine agreements which we've signed, but it wouldn't be unusual if it were. So we did a very similar thing with the rollout of the 2009 H1n1 vaccine for the influenza pandemic in 2009, and that was proven down at a later date to be a very, very safe vaccine. So it's not an admission or an indication that anything is wrong with the safety profile. It's one of efficiency.
And Gordon, I don't know if you know anything about this. I mean, it has happened before, but of course it does feed into people who think, well, if the government are offering this, I'm not sure I think that it's safe.
Yeah, so I come from an era when we used to make vaccines in the UK up to about 1980. And what happened was that the economics of making vaccines was so uncompetitive with other forms of medicines for therapy that vaccines almost to the side by many companies. And just to keep companies in the game, the governments, particularly in the US, started to bring this kind of legislation in part for the reasons that were just explained by Mark, but also to keep companies actually making vaccines which were viewed as being poorly profitable for some of the reasons that we've already alluded to.
That's very true. Sorry, yeah, that's very true. Vaccines are a pretty poor investment generally from a pharmaceutical research and development point of view. They don't make much economic sense, to such a degree that in influenza especially, we've lost a number of manufacturers from the manufacturing space over the last 30 years. So the desire to keep manufacturers in the game, where they're dealing with very, very small profit margins per unit, necessitates such efficiencies within the actual market, like these product liability schemes. So it's about efficiencies of the courts and efficiencies of the manufacturers. It's not an indication or an admission that harm is caused by vaccines. It's a very, very rare circumstance in which you will find an adverse event, but we're talking about something that's given to the vast majority of the population on Earth. Of course, there will be some degree of adverse reaction to them, but they're typically very, very small and include things like a rash, a headache, soreness at the injection site, that sort of thing.
And Susan, there's a behavioural aspect to this too, because if people get it into their heads, well, if the government are offering this limited liability to companies if the vaccine goes wrong, people automatically then think, well, I don't want to take it.
Well, I think it was a very good question and also very good answers. And I learned a bit by listening to that. And I think this is exactly what we've got to have, is a really good conversation where people have got many different ways of raising concerns, raising very sensible questions like this question in an environment where there are knowledgeable people who can answer those in a dispassionate, neutral way, where there's no political drivers, there's no commercial drivers. It's just a discussion between people who have knowledge and have no vested interests at all. So the more that programs like this can be aired and people can come on raise these very sensible questions and get expert answers, the better.
Well, Susan, I feel if you've learned something over the last half an hour, my mission here is complete tonight. But we do still have half an hour to go, so keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. It's 9:33. News headlines on LBC with Lucinda Horsley.
Text 84850. This is LBC.
9:37 on LBC. We have our expert panel, Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner, Professor Susan Michie and Professor Gordon Dougan here to answer your questions on any aspect of the vaccines. Leslie is in Oxford. Hi, Leslie.
Hello. Yeah, I was just particularly relating to the Pfizer vaccine. How are you going to get around all the freezer space if it has to be stored at -80?
Well, that's a very good question. Of course, Matt Hancock famously bought 5,000 fridges, didn't he, to be prepared for a no-deal Brexit. I don't know what's happened to them, but I suspect a fridge isn't going to quite cut it here. Mark Eccleston-Turner, one for you.
From a UK perspective, we should generally be quite well set up. The cold chain infrastructure in the UK is quite advanced. It will be stretched to its limit, but we have super freezers at hospitals and at other sites across the UK that can go down to -80. Mm-hmm. And then most GP practices won't have that sort of freezer. So we're talking about sort of mass vaccination at specific sites like hospitals. Or
will GP surgeries have to get them, or?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. That would be part of the government's rollout plan. I think what's more likely is that vaccination will happen at a site which has the freezer. I think it's easier to bring people to the freezer than to move the freezer.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just wondering how that would all work out. Yeah,
I think the real complication comes when we're talking about rolling this vaccine out globally. There are very, very few countries outside of high-income countries which have the necessary capacity to store the Pfizer vaccine and move it around the country in their own cold chain. And the most recent WHO estimate is that that 50% of vaccines which are made around the world are lost in the cold chain because freezers break. Particularly in developing countries, power goes out, freezers are not as efficient as they should be. And that's when we're talking about keeping a vaccine at between 2 degrees and 8 degrees Celsius, which most vaccines need to be. When we're talking about a vaccine at -70, the real infrastructural problems will come when we're talking about trying to get this to people in need in developing countries. The UK's infrastructure is pretty advanced and will manage to move and safely store this vaccine quite efficiently.
Susan Michie, what sort of impact could all this news on vaccines have on lockdown restrictions? Because there may be some people at the margins who think, well, if the vaccine's coming, I don't really need to obey lockdown rules as much as I might have done before.
This is a real concern. The vaccines, however good, however quickly they come along, will make no difference whatsoever to the second wave. The most that they will do is prevent a third wave next year, if we're lucky. So everybody has to keep their feet on the pedals of not only adhering to the restrictions, but also thinking about all the ways in which this pesky virus transmits from one person to another. So ensuring that hands and surfaces are disinfected, ensuring that if you're inside, that you try and keep windows and doors open to the extent that you can, because the virus doesn't like ventilation. So keep the ventilation going. And the reason for the lockdown, sadly, is that our test, trace and isolate system isn't up to the job, certainly not in England, of being able to handle outbreaks. So really what we need to do at this point in time, if we want to maximise the chance of getting out of this pandemic as soon as possible, or this wave as soon as possible, minimise having to go into such a thing again, is to really listen to the public health experts, and I hope the government does, and get the test, trace and isolate system embedded in the localities, run by people with the expertise and experience to do it, who are trusted by the local communities. But that does require giving resources to do that. So it has to be a combination, a kind of social contract really, between us citizens really doing what we can to do the social distancing and keeping us and everybody else safe, But the government, on the other hand, getting the test, trace and isolate system up to speed, which many other countries throughout the world have done, and they're pretty well getting back to business as usual.
Gordon, I think you wanted to come in on this.
No, so going back to the freezing situation, interestingly, one of the Ebola vaccines that was used in DR Congo and in West Africa required freezing, and they did set up an infrastructure, but you can never maintain that kind of an infrastructure in those settings. So maintaining an infrastructure is much more difficult than putting it in. And it is good news, though, that some of the other vaccines that are coming through are much more appropriate for those sorts of settings.
Okay. Leslie, thank you. Let's go to Maria, who's in Greenford. Hello, Maria.
Hello, Ian. Hi. I want to raise a question, a specific question. My daughter has sickle cell, and so her immune system can be easily compromised. But what I want to find out is, have they tested this vaccine on people with underlying conditions, and how effective has it been? And also, if she takes this vaccine, will it interfere with any of her other medication? She already takes the flu jab and the pneumonia jab already. But because her immune system can get compromised very easily, has it been tested out on people who have underlying issues, or have they just tested it on healthy people?
See, that's a really interesting question. And Pfizer, I think they've done tests on 43,500 people. But Gordon Dougan, they can't really cover everybody in those tests, can they?
Well, in fact, they will avoid people who have compromised conditions. And so the answer at the moment is that these vaccines will not have been tested, at least to my knowledge, in vulnerable people.
I think we've
got. So I do a lot of work in Africa, and there's a lot of sympathisers, in Africa with sickle cell and are compromised. So there are certain vaccines that will work better in vulnerable people than others. For example, live replicating vaccines like yellow fever are not appropriate. It's better to use a vaccine potentially like the Pfizer vaccine, but more like the GSK vaccine that's coming through, which is just based on a protein and adjuvant in people who are vulnerable and compromised. And we'll have to take that very, very carefully in a very controlled manner. So
in terms of what Maria should do, or her daughter should do, what would you say?
Well, I think she needs to go. I mean, she's obviously been taking good advice from her GP or for a medical practitioner. And I think she needs to go and talk to those authorities and ask that question to them. And if they feel that she's vulnerable or to the virus, they will then advise the most appropriate way of vaccinating. I mean, similar things apply to people like pregnant women, for example. Some vaccines are recommended in pregnant women, some are not recommended in pregnant women. You need to go to somebody who really knows the ins and outs of this to get good advice.
Maria?
So where would I go for this good advice? Because obviously my GP is just general. She's not under any, I suppose I could go to the Sickle Cell Society or something, but I don't know if they've got that information. And it is a worry, because obviously she does want to protect herself, but how can she, take a vaccine that hasn't actually been tested on somebody who looks like her?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So what I'm saying is, you go talk to your general practitioner, they would have to refer you to an expert. And there are people, I know people, for example, in London, in child health hospitals, and there are specialists who can give special advice. And I think people who are in special categories, because it's such a new vaccine, will have to get specialist advice, and they will have to guide based upon their knowledge and experience, not on their knowledge of this particular vaccine. So you have to rely on people who are knowledgeable in these areas.
Maria, thank you very much. We'll come to more of your calls in just a moment.
Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
10 to 10 on LBC. Let's go back to your calls to our expert panel. Fawad is in Wembley. Hello, Fawad.
Hi. First-time caller, but regular listener.
Fantastic.
My question is, obviously Pfizer and Moderna, the two companies, have claimed 90-95% of the success rate for the vaccine that they have made. they are very reputable companies, no doubt. But are these numbers verified independently, or is the government working with them together? Or this is my question, because of obviously they are reputable, but because of the extent and the impact of this vaccine and the large scale that it's going to be implemented on, are they independently verified, these figures, or not?
Susan, Michie, do you know the answer to that question? I think it's a good question in a way, isn't it?
It's a very good question, and usually what you find is that the success rates, when you move from the companies doing the trials in a very controlled way to rolling something out into everyday clinics, the success rate tends to go down. So that's one thing always to bear in mind. But the other thing is we do have a regulatory body in this country with very well-tested and thorough and good practices. And those regulatory bodies are independent of the commercial companies. And this is absolutely key to ensure the safety and to assure every aspect of both the process of what's been gone through to get the vaccines and also the outcome the other end. So, yes, I think we can be reassured that even though at the moment we only have the company data, before we are actually offered the vaccine, we'll have had a good, thorough, independent regulatory process.
Mark Eccleston-Turner, there is a reputational win here for Pfizer for being the first. Some people will be suspicious of anyone who's the first because they think, well, they want to be the first because it's good PR for them. Are people right to be so cynical?
No, they're not. Pfizer didn't choose to release this data. It wasn't released by them as a company. It was released by the Oversight and Monitoring Board, the Pfizer data last week, and it wasn't their choice to put it out there. It was independently chosen to put it out there by an oversight body, which is overseeing all of these trials. So we already have an oversight mechanism in place which chose to release the Pfizer vaccine. It wasn't them doing it on behalf of their shareholders or anything like that. But what's going to happen next is even more verification. So the studies are still ongoing for a little bit longer. And then what's going to happen is a couple of things. First of all, Pfizer will submit their data and submit their manuscripts and some papers to the scientific community, people like Gordon, who will read the study, read the data and verify it and scrutinize it. And the data will also get submitted to regulatory agencies. So independent government bodies whose job it is to license drugs and vaccines on the basis of safety and efficacy. And what's going to happen is all of Moderna's data and all of Pfizer's data is going to be submitted to these government departments who will independently verify the information, independently assess it, and evaluate that data. And on the basis of that, make a determination as to whether these vaccines will get licensed and be available to the British public or not.
Fawad.
So there are a number of stages.
Okay, Fawad, are you reassured?
Yes, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you.
Again, I feel as though my mission is almost complete, but we've got another five minutes of our mission to go. Philip is a new caller in Malta. I don't think I've ever had a caller from Malta. Philip, you are the first. What would you like to ask?
Hello, good evening. I listen to you all the time, by the way.
Excellent.
Spare time I have. Yes, what I'd like to ask is, what do we know about the long-term effects? We know in the immediate, it seems, but what guarantees do we have on the long-term effects? I mean, obviously, it needs to go through the test of time. Or are there medical projections that will make people feel safe?
Gordon Dougan.
Yeah, so we have a lot of experience, really, in how things can go wrong with making vaccines, and a lot of vaccines are stopped very early on. And so we've got signals which might indicate adversity in terms of response. And so we'll be looking very carefully for those. We've got through the first phase where it looks like many of the local immediate reactions are not severe and they're not adverse. And then we'll be looking for other things like potential immunological signals that look off target, or other symptoms that people would be vigilant about. And you can find documentations of this in the literature, what we call post-licensing analysis, where they'll be doing revalidation of the vaccine continuously post-licensing. We'll just have to accept on this occasion that we're in a game where we've got a health and an economic battle going on, and that we're watching a vaccine being developed in real time for the first time.
Yes, that gives us more comfort, for sure. Mm-hmm.
It's worth adding to that point that this isn't unusual. Ongoing pharmacovigilance, so ongoing monitoring of vaccines for safety and efficacy, happens with all vaccines, even vaccines which have been around for a very long time, like the polio vaccine or the rotavirus vaccine. We are constantly evaluating the safety data of those and the efficacy data. So this isn't something unusual or unique to COVID. It is something that we do with all vaccines constantly.
Okay, Philip, thank you. Let's finish off with a text here from Nick. A lot of people have asked this. He says, Iain, the very valid reason vaccines take years and not months to get safety approval is that often serious side effects take years to appear. 1,000 brilliant scientists working 24/7 for 8 months on vaccines can't bypass that hurdle. Please ask your panel how on earth can safety be thus assured with any vaccine anytime soon? Mark, let's put that one to you first. We've literally got 90 seconds to go.
So the first thing is the number of participants in these studies that we're talking about is well and above what we'd ordinarily see with typical vaccine studies and vaccine clinical trials. So that is one thing that gives us some reassurance about the safety profile of these vaccines.
Quick final word from you, Gordon.
Yeah, I think we have to do a risk assessment. So there's not many licensed vaccines now that we have which are known to, or any that are known to give long-term significant side effects. So, and often these things might be unanticipated, and they're often in rare individuals rather than a general population. And so we have to, take each of us needs to do their own assessment of this and say, what are the best features of this vaccine? Where are we in terms of validating the vaccine? And we're going to continue to validate the vaccine as we go on into the future. That's the reality of where we are.
And final 30 seconds to Susan Michie.
Yeah, well, the answer is we don't know for sure the long-term effects. What we do know is that there's an evaluation mechanism put in place so that data will carry on being collected over the months and the years, and a very close eye will be kept on things. So we don't know everything yet, and we've got to just remember we don't know everything yet. Okay. But we keep on looking and measuring and reporting.
Well, thank you very much to my panel, Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner from Keele University, Professor Susan Michie from the Centre for Behavioural Change at UCL, and Professor Gordon Dougan from the University of Cambridge. I'll be back tomorrow from 7. Coming up at 1, it's Darren